Genesis chapter 27 verse 1. And it came to pass, that when Isaac was old, and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, he called Esau his eldest son, and said unto him, My son. And he said unto him, Behold, here am I. This verse sets the stage for a significant event in the book of Genesis involving Isaac, his two sons, Esau and Jacob, and the blessing of the firstborn. Let's delve deeper into the context and explore the lessons we can learn from this passage. Context. At this point in the biblical narrative, Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, has grown old and his eyesight has weakened. He realizes that his time on earth is drawing near, and he wishes to pass on the blessing of the firstborn to his eldest son, Esau. In ancient Near Eastern culture, the blessing of the firstborn held immense significance and carried with it privileges and responsibilities. Lessons from Genesis chapter 27 verse 1. The limitations of human senses. The verse begins by highlighting Isaac's condition of having dim eyes, making him unable to see clearly. It serves as a reminder that our physical abilities are temporary and subject to decline. It also emphasizes the importance of relying on God's guidance rather than our limited perceptions. Generational blessings and responsibilities. The blessing of the firstborn was traditionally bestowed upon the eldest son, signifying a transfer of leadership and spiritual authority within the family. Isaac's intention to bless Esau illustrates the importance of passing down blessings, values, and responsibilities to future generations. The role of parental authority. Isaac's call to Esau reflects his role as a father figure, seeking to fulfill his duty in passing on the blessing. It reminds us of the significance of parental authority and the responsibility parents have to guide and bless their children, both spiritually and practically. The complexity of human relationships. The events that unfold in subsequent verses after Genesis chapter 27 verse 1 reveal a complex web of relationships and emotions. Isaac's favoritism toward Esau and Rebekah's favoritism toward Jacob, along with the deception and manipulation that follows, highlight the potential pitfalls of family dynamics and the consequences that arise from such actions. God's sovereignty and faithfulness. While this verse primarily focuses on Isaac's intention to bless Esau, the larger narrative highlights God's sovereignty and faithfulness. God had already chosen Jacob, the younger son, to inherit the covenant blessings, as revealed to Rebekah during her pregnancy. Despite human attempts to alter the course of events, God's plan unfolds according to his purposes. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 1 sets the stage for a pivotal moment in the biblical narrative, highlighting themes such as human limitations, generational blessings, parental authority, the complexities of relationships, and God's sovereignty. As we study this passage, we can reflect on the lessons it offers and seek to apply them in our own lives, understanding the importance of God's guidance, the responsibilities of parenthood, and the trust we should place in God's ultimate plan. Genesis chapter 27 verse 2. And he said, Behold now, I am old, I know not the day of my death. In this verse, we find Isaac, the son of Abraham and the father of Jacob and Esau, reflecting on his old age and the uncertainty of his remaining days. This verse is significant because it sets the stage for the events that unfold in the following chapters of Genesis. Context and background. Isaac was the promised child of Abraham and Sarah, born in their old age. Isaac's birth fulfilled God's covenant with Abraham, and he was the heir of the promises given to Abraham. As Isaac grew older, his eyesight had weakened, and he realized that his days were drawing to a close. Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was aware of God's prophecy that the elder son, Esau, would serve the younger son, Jacob. Esau was Isaac's favorite son, while Rebekah favored Jacob. Isaac's awareness of his impending death. In Genesis chapter 27 chapter 1 verse 1, Isaac calls for Esau, his older son, and asks him to prepare a meal so that he may bless him before his death. However, before requesting the meal, Isaac expresses his awareness of his old age and the uncertainty of when his death will occur. The phrase, "I know not the day of my death," signifies Isaac's acknowledgement that he does not have control over the timing of his passing. It highlights the frailty of human life and the inevitability of death. The implications of Isaac's words. Isaac's uncertainty about his remaining time on earth serves as a catalyst for the events that follow. The blessing Isaac intends to bestow on Esau is significant because it carries the weight of divine favor and inheritance. Isaac intends to pass on the blessing to Esau, unaware that Rebekah and Jacob have devised a plan to deceive him. Rebekah, acting upon her knowledge of God's prophecy, conspires with Jacob to trick Isaac into blessing Jacob instead. The consequences of this deception will have a profound impact on the relationships and future of Isaac's family. Lessons from Genesis chapter 27 verse 2. Acknowledging the uncertainty of our lifespan can serve as a reminder to live with purpose and make the most of the time we have. It is essential to recognize our mortality and use our days wisely, investing in meaningful relationships and pursuing righteousness. Isaac's story also teaches us about the dangers of favoritism and manipulation within families. It serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to foster love, honesty, and fairness in our relationships. Additionally, the events that unfold after this verse demonstrate God's sovereignty in working through flawed individuals to fulfill His plans and promises. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 2 highlights Isaac's awareness of his old age and the uncertainty of his remaining days. This verse sets the stage for the subsequent events in which deception and manipulation play a significant role in the transfer of blessings within Isaac's family. It reminds us of the importance of acknowledging our mortality, living purposefully, and fostering healthy relationships. Genesis chapter 27 verse 3. Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver and thy bow, and go out to the field, and take me some venison. This verse is a part of the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex relationship and significant roles in the history of Israel. To understand the context of Genesis chapter 27 verse 3, let's explore the broader narrative leading up to this verse. In Genesis chapter 25, we learn that Isaac, the son of Abraham, married Rebekah. However, Rebekah was barren, and they prayed to the Lord for a child. God answered their prayers, and Rebekah conceived twins, who struggled within her womb. The Lord revealed to Rebekah that the two children would become two nations, with the older serving the younger. This prophecy already sets the stage for the eventual conflict between Jacob and Esau. Genesis chapter 25 verses 29 through 34 tells the story of how Esau, being the firstborn, sold his birthright to Jacob in a moment of hunger. Esau, a skillful hunter, came back famished from the field and saw Jacob cooking a stew. Jacob used this opportunity to negotiate the birthright, and Esau, prioritizing his immediate hunger over his birthright, agreed to the exchange. Genesis chapter 27 then presents us with the pivotal moment in the story. Isaac, aging and knowing that his death is drawing near, desired to bless his firstborn son, Esau, before passing away. However, Rebekah overheard Isaac's intentions and devised a plan to ensure that Jacob, her favorite son, would receive the blessing instead. Genesis chapter 27 verses 1 through 2 sets the stage for the events of verse 3. Isaac calls Esau and asks him to prepare a meal of venison, his favorite food, after which Isaac intends to bless him. Rebekah, aware of the situation, immediately intervenes and instructs Jacob to obtain the blessing instead. In verse 3, Rebekah tells Jacob to take his weapons, quiver, and bow, and go out to the field to hunt game, specifically venison, so that he can present it as if he were Esau. This verse highlights a key aspect of Esau's identity as a skillful hunter and outdoorsman. He excelled in providing food for his family through hunting, and it was his hunting prowess that made Isaac desire to bless him. However, this verse also reveals Rebekah's cunning plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob. As the story progresses, Jacob follows his mother's instructions, successfully obtains the game, and with the help of his mother, disguises himself as Esau by wearing Esau's clothes and covering his arms with animal skins. Isaac, who is now visually impaired due to old age, mistakes Jacob for Esau and blesses him instead. The events that unfold after Genesis chapter 27 verse 3 reveal the consequences of the deception and the subsequent fallout between Jacob and Esau. When Esau learns about what transpired, he becomes furious and vows to kill Jacob once their father passes away. This conflict eventually leads to Jacob fleeing from his family and spending many years in exile before being reconciled with Esau later in the narrative. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 3 is a significant verse within the story of Jacob and Esau. It highlights Esau's hunting abilities and the deception orchestrated by Rebekah to ensure that Jacob receives the blessing meant for the firstborn. The consequences of this deception have far-reaching effects, leading to conflict and eventual reconciliation between the two brothers. Genesis chapter 27 verse 4, "And make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die." This verse is a part of the narrative of Isaac, the son of Abraham, as he reaches old age and desires to bless his eldest son, Esau. In this verse, Isaac asks Esau to prepare a delicious meal for him, so that after eating it, Isaac would be ready to bless him. The concept of blessing held great significance in the ancient Near East, and receiving a father's blessing carried immense spiritual and material importance. Isaac intended to confer his blessing upon Esau before his death, as he believed that the time for him to pass on this important inheritance was drawing near. It is worth noting that Isaac's wife, Rebekah, overheard this conversation and devised a plan to ensure that their younger son, Jacob, received the blessing instead. Rebekah believed that Jacob, despite not being the eldest son, was the one chosen by God to receive the birthright and the blessing. She guided Jacob in preparing a similar meal and disguising himself as Esau to deceive his blind father and receive the blessing intended for Esau. This event leads to significant consequences and a strained relationship between Esau and Jacob. Genesis chapter 27 verse 4 highlights the desire of Isaac to bless his eldest son, Esau, as well as the cultural importance placed on this blessing. It also introduces the subsequent events that unfold in the narrative of Jacob and Esau, which have far-reaching implications throughout the book of Genesis. Overall, this verse serves as a starting point for understanding the complex dynamics within the family of Abraham and sets the stage for the unfolding drama and eventual reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. It also reveals the consequences that arise when human beings try to manipulate situations to fulfill their own desires instead of trusting in God's plan. Genesis chapter 27 verse 5. "And Rebekah heard when Isaac spake to Esau his son. And Esau went to the field to hunt for venison, and to bring it." This verse is part of the larger narrative of the book of Genesis, specifically the story of Jacob and Esau. It provides us with insights into the dynamics within Isaac's family and the events that led to the eventual deception of Isaac by Jacob. In this verse, we find Isaac, who is advanced in age, planning to bestow his blessing upon his eldest son, Esau. Isaac had a fondness for Esau, who was skilled in hunting and a man of the field. Esau had been the firstborn and therefore entitled to receive the birthright and blessing traditionally given to the eldest son. Rebekah, Isaac's wife and the mother of Esau and Jacob, overhears Isaac's intention to bless Esau. However, Rebekah favored Jacob, their younger son. She desired the birthright and blessing for Jacob instead of Esau. Rebekah devises a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob. The subsequent verses in Genesis chapter 27 reveal Rebekah's plan, where she instructs Jacob to disguise himself as Esau and bring her 2 young goats. Rebekah then cooks the goats in a way that imitates Esau's preferred food, and she dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes, covering his hands and neck with goatskins to mimic Esau's hairy appearance. When Jacob presents himself before Isaac, the aged patriarch is initially suspicious due to Jacob's voice sounding like Jacob's, but his hands feeling like Esau's. However, Isaac eventually blesses Jacob, mistakenly believing him to be Esau. This act of deception sets in motion a chain of events that deeply affect the relationships and destinies of Jacob, Esau, and their descendants. The story of Jacob and Esau is a complex and layered narrative, highlighting themes of favoritism, deception, and the consequences of one's actions. It also serves as a reminder that God's plans often transcend human schemes and manipulations. Despite the deception, God's covenant promise to Abraham continues through Jacob, who later becomes known as Israel, and his descendants. This verse, Genesis chapter 27 verse 5, serves as a pivotal point in the story, introducing the initial plans for deception that lead to significant consequences for the characters involved. It serves as a reminder of the importance of honesty, integrity, and the consequences that can arise from attempting to manipulate or deceive others. Genesis chapter 27 verse 6. And Rebekah spake unto Jacob her son, saying, Behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying. Context: Genesis chapter 27 tells the story of Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, being old and blind, wanted to bless his eldest son Esau before he died. However, Rebekah, who favored Jacob, devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. Key points and lessons from Genesis chapter 27 verse 6, Deception and its consequences. This verse highlights the deceptive plan that Rebekah initiated. Instead of trusting in God's promise that Jacob would receive the blessing, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, Rebekah resorted to deceit. The passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of acting deceitfully and the potential harm it can cause. God's sovereignty. Despite the deception taking place, it's important to recognize that God's plan and purpose were ultimately fulfilled through this event. God had already revealed to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, indicating Jacob's future prominence. While Rebekah's actions were flawed, God's sovereignty prevailed. Human flaws and God's redemptive work. The story of Jacob and Esau showcases the brokenness of human nature and the flawed choices people make. Rebekah's favoritism and deceptive plan were not in line with God's ideal, yet God still used these imperfect circumstances to bring about his purposes and ultimately work in the lives of Jacob and Esau. Consequences of strained relationships. Rebekah's scheme strained the relationship between Jacob and Esau, leading to years of separation and conflict. This passage serves as a cautionary reminder about the damaging consequences of deceit and favoritism within families. It encourages us to strive for honesty, reconciliation, and healthy relationships. Application. The story of Jacob and Esau provides valuable lessons for our lives. It reminds us to trust in God's promises and rely on his sovereignty rather than resorting to deceitful means. It emphasizes the importance of maintaining healthy family relationships and dealing with conflicts in a righteous and open manner. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 6 invites us to reflect on the themes of trust, deception, consequences, and God's ability to work through imperfect situations. It serves as a reminder of the importance of aligning our actions with God's will and seeking his guidance in all circumstances. Genesis chapter 27 verse 7. Bring me venison, and make me savory meat, that I may eat, and bless thee before the Lord before my death. Context. Genesis chapter 27 records the events surrounding the deception of Isaac by his sons, Jacob and Esau. Isaac, who was old and blind, intended to bless his firstborn son, Esau, before his impending death. However, Jacob and his mother, Rebekah, devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. God's promise. In Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, when Rebekah was pregnant with Jacob and Esau, God revealed to her that the older would serve the younger. This divine prophecy indicated that Jacob was chosen by God to carry on the covenant blessings given to Abraham and Isaac, despite societal norms favoring the firstborn. Isaac's request. Isaac, unaware of God's plan, believed it was time to pass on the blessing to his eldest son, Esau. In Genesis chapter 27 verses 3 and 4, Isaac asked Esau to prepare a meal of venison, his favorite food, so that he could bless him. Isaac intended to bestow his final blessings, including a special prayer for fertility and prosperity, upon Esau. Rebekah's deception. Rebekah overheard Isaac's conversation with Esau and realized it was an opportunity to fulfill God's prophecy. She instructed Jacob to deceive Isaac by pretending to be Esau and bringing him a meal of venison. Rebekah prepared the meal, dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, and covered his hands and neck with animal skins to simulate Esau's hairy appearance. Jacob's reluctance. Although Jacob initially hesitated to deceive his father, Rebekah convinced him by assuring him of her responsibility if anything went wrong. Jacob ultimately went along with the plan, bringing the prepared meal to his father. Lessons and reflections. God's sovereignty. The story highlights God's sovereignty in choosing Jacob as the recipient of the blessing, despite human expectations and societal norms. It reminds us that God's plans and purposes may not align with our human understanding, and His will prevails. Deception and consequences. The events in Genesis chapter 27 reveal the consequences of deception and manipulation. While God used this situation to accomplish His purposes, it resulted in strained relationships, family conflicts, and years of separation between Jacob and Esau. Trusting God's timing. Rebekah and Jacob's actions demonstrate a lack of trust in God's timing and ability to fulfill His promises. Rather than waiting for God's plan to unfold, they sought to manipulate the situation. This serves as a reminder to trust in God's faithfulness and His ability to fulfill His promises in His own time. Honoring parents. Although Isaac's blessing was intended for Esau, it is important to note the significance of honoring parents and respecting their authority. Rebekah and Jacob's actions, motivated by God's plan, should not be seen as a justification for deception or disobedience. This study of Genesis chapter 27 verse 7 helps us understand the events leading to Jacob's deception of Isaac. It provides lessons about God's sovereignty, the consequences of deception, the importance of trusting God's timing, and the significance of honoring parents. It reminds us to seek God's will and trust in His faithfulness, even when circumstances seem uncertain. Genesis chapter 27 verse 8. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to that which I command thee. This verse is part of the account of Isaac, the son of Abraham, who is old and blind at this point in the narrative. Isaac is about to bless his eldest son, Esau, before he dies. However, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overhears the conversation and conspires with their younger son, Jacob, to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. The verse itself is spoken by Isaac to Esau, instructing him to listen to his voice and carry out his commands. In a broader sense, this verse reveals the patriarchal authority that Isaac held over his family, as he expected his son to submit to his words and follow his instructions. From a theological perspective, this verse prompts us to consider the themes of obedience, deception, and the consequences of our actions. While Isaac's intention was to bless Esau, his actions led to the fulfillment of God's earlier promise that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. God had already chosen Jacob to carry the covenant promises forward, and Isaac's blessing inadvertently aligns with God's plan. The verse also raises ethical questions about the means used to achieve God's purpose. Jacob and Rebekah employed deception to ensure that Jacob received the blessing, which was traditionally reserved for the firstborn. While God's plan ultimately came to pass, the actions taken by Jacob and Rebekah to deceive Isaac were not commendable. This incident serves as a reminder that God's sovereign will can be accomplished despite human failings and shortcomings. It also highlights the importance of integrity, trust, and obedience in our relationships and interactions with others. God desires that we obey His commands and follow His ways, but it is crucial that we do so with honesty and integrity. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 8 reveals Isaac's expectation of obedience from his son Esau, But it also raises questions about the consequences of deception and the fulfillment of God's plan. It reminds us of the importance of aligning our actions with God's will, acting with integrity, and being mindful of the consequences of our choices. Genesis chapter 27 verse 9. Go now to the flock, and fetch me from thence 2 good kids of the goats, and I will make them savory meat for thy father, such as he loveth. Genesis chapter 27 verse 9 is part of the narrative surrounding Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. This passage takes place during a pivotal moment when Jacob, with the guidance and encouragement of his mother Rebekah, seeks to receive his father Isaac's blessing intended for the eldest son, Esau. In the preceding verses, Rebekah overhears Isaac instructing Esau to prepare a meal for him and receive the blessing afterward. Realizing that Isaac is nearing the end of his life and that the time for blessings is approaching, Rebekah devises a plan to ensure that Jacob, her favorite son, receives the blessing instead. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 9, Rebekah instructs Jacob to go to the flock and bring back 2 good kids of the goats so that she can prepare a savory meal for Isaac, imitating the delicacies that Esau would typically hunt and prepare. The intention is for Jacob to disguise himself as Esau, presenting the meal to Isaac and securing the blessing meant for the firstborn. This verse reveals several important themes and dynamics within the story. One theme is the struggle between Jacob and Esau for the birthright and blessing. As the older twin, Esau was entitled to receive the birthright and the blessing from his father, which carried significant privileges and responsibilities. However, Jacob and Rebekah's actions demonstrate their desire to secure the blessing for Jacob instead. Another theme is the use of deception. Rebekah and Jacob's plan involves deceiving Isaac by disguising Jacob as Esau, with the intention of receiving the blessing fraudulently. This act of deception raises moral questions and highlights the consequences that can arise from manipulating others for personal gain. Additionally, this passage portrays the tension within the family. Rebekah favors Jacob, while Isaac favors Esau. This favoritism contributes to the conflict between the brothers and serves as a backdrop for the subsequent events in their lives. The story of Jacob and Esau in Genesis chapter 27 serves as a reminder of the complexities and consequences that can arise from deceit and favoritism. It demonstrates the far-reaching effects of actions taken to secure personal goals, illustrating the importance of honesty, integrity, and the significance of divine blessings. Genesis chapter 27 verse 10. And thou shalt bring it to thy father, that he may eat, and that he may bless thee before his death. Context: Genesis chapter 27 tells the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham, who was preparing to bless his oldest son Esau before his death. However, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard the plan and devised a scheme to ensure that their younger son Jacob would receive the blessing instead. In verse 10, Rebekah instructs Jacob to bring the meal she has prepared to his father, so that he may eat and bless him. The importance of the blessing. In biblical times, a father's blessing held significant meaning and was considered a crucial event in the life of the recipient. The patriarchal blessing was not merely a formality but carried spiritual, emotional, and material implications. It conveyed a sense of authority, inheritance, and divine favor upon the recipient. Rebekah's intervention. Rebekah, favoring Jacob over Esau, took it upon herself to ensure that Jacob received the blessing. She devised a plan to deceive Isaac, who was blind and unaware of her intentions. Rebekah's actions were driven by her understanding of God's earlier prophecy that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. However, instead of trusting in God's timing and sovereignty, she took matters into her own hands, resorting to deception. Lessons on deception. Rebekah's actions raise ethical and moral questions. While God's sovereign will to fulfill his promise could have been achieved without Rebekah's deception, she chose to manipulate the situation. This incident serves as a reminder that our human attempts to fulfill God's purposes can often lead to negative consequences. It is essential to trust in God's timing and methods rather than resorting to deceitful practices. God's faithfulness. Despite Rebekah's actions, God's plan and purpose prevailed. His promise to Abraham regarding Jacob's role in the covenant continued to unfold. However, it is important to note that Jacob faced significant consequences as a result of the deception, including strained relationships with his family and years of hardship. Trusting in God's sovereignty, the story of Jacob and Esau reminds us of the importance of trusting in God's sovereignty. God's plans are not dependent on human manipulation or deceit. We should learn from Rebekah's actions and seek to align ourselves with God's will, trusting in His faithfulness to fulfill His promises in His perfect timing. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 10 highlights Rebekah's instructions to Jacob to bring the prepared meal to Isaac so that he may bless him before his death. This verse serves as a starting point for exploring the themes of blessing, deception, and God's sovereignty in the story of Jacob and Esau. Genesis chapter 27 verse 11. And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Genesis chapter 27 recounts the story of Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. In this particular verse, Jacob is having a conversation with his mother, Rebekah, discussing his plan to deceive their father, Isaac, in order to receive the blessing that was intended for Esau. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 27 verse 11, it's important to provide some context. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, the father's blessing held great importance. It was more than a mere verbal expression, it carried spiritual and practical implications. The blessing had the power to confer authority, inheritance rights, and a divine endorsement upon the recipient. In this chapter, Isaac, who was old and nearly blind, intended to bless his eldest son, Esau, before his death. However, Rebekah, who favored Jacob, devised a plan to trick Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob instead. Knowing that Isaac's sense of touch would play a crucial role in distinguishing between Esau and Jacob, Rebekah assisted Jacob in disguising himself as Esau. In verse 11, Jacob points out to his mother the physical difference between himself and Esau. He describes Esau as a hairy man, while he considers himself to be smooth. Jacob's observation is significant because it highlights the contrast between the two brothers and emphasizes the need for deception in order to receive the blessing. This verse reveals Jacob's concern that his smooth skin would give away his true identity. Jacob was aware that Isaac's sense of touch would be one of the determining factors in Isaac's decision to bless him. Esau, being a hunter, possessed a hairy body, which would help him resemble Esau more closely. The context of this verse raises moral and ethical questions regarding Jacob's actions. While the narrative portrays Jacob's deception as successful, it also serves as a reminder of the consequences of manipulating and deceiving others to achieve personal gain. The story of Jacob and Esau is a cautionary tale that illustrates the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of deceptive actions. It is important to note that while the Bible records this account, it does not necessarily endorse or condone Jacob's deception. Rather, it serves as a historical account of the actions of these individuals and their consequences. The subsequent events in Jacob's life demonstrate how his deceitful actions affected his relationships with others and led to various challenges and hardships. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 11 provides a glimpse into the conversation between Jacob and Rebekah, highlighting Jacob's concern about his physical differences with his brother Esau. This verse sets the stage for the deception that follows and emphasizes the moral complexities and consequences of Jacob's actions. Genesis chapter 27 chapter 12 verse 1. My father peradventure will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver, and I shall bring a curse upon me, and not a blessing. Context. In this verse, we find Jacob expressing his concern to his mother, Rebekah, about the plan to deceive his father, Isaac, in order to receive his brother Esau's blessing. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, and Isaac, their father, was old and blind. Rebekah had overheard Isaac planning to bless Esau, and she devised a plan for Jacob to impersonate Esau and receive the blessing instead. Key points. The theme of deception. This verse highlights Jacob's awareness that if he were to be discovered as a deceiver by his father, he would face severe consequences. Jacob acknowledges the potential curse that could come upon him if he is caught pretending to be Esau. This episode reveals the moral dilemma and the consequences of deceit. The significance of blessings. Blessings held great importance in the ancient Near Eastern culture, and receiving a blessing from a father was a significant event. The blessing was not merely a wish for good fortune but carried with it the authority to determine the future of the recipient, including inheritance rights and spiritual significance. Jacob desired this blessing because he understood its significance and longed for the favor and prosperity it would bring. Jacob's concerns and doubts. Jacob's concern about being discovered as a deceiver shows a conflict within him. While he follows his mother's instructions, he is well aware that deceiving his father goes against the principles of honesty and integrity. His fear of bringing a curse upon himself indicates his awareness of the moral consequences of his actions. God's sovereignty and Jacob's role. Despite the deceitful nature of Jacob's actions, it is essential to note that God's sovereign plan was still at work. In Genesis chapter 25, chapter 23 verse 1, God had already foretold that the older, Esau, would serve the younger, Jacob. Jacob's actions were an attempt to fulfill God's promise, albeit through deceitful means. This episode serves as a reminder that God can work through flawed individuals to accomplish His purposes, although the consequences of their actions may still follow. Application. Honesty and integrity. The story of Jacob's deception reminds us of the importance of honesty and integrity in our actions. Deceit and manipulation may seem advantageous in the short term, but they often lead to negative consequences and strain relationships. We should strive to be people of integrity, trusting in God's faithfulness rather than resorting to dishonest means. God's sovereignty. Jacob's story also teaches us that God is sovereign over our lives, even when we make mistakes or act in ways contrary to His will. However, it is crucial to recognize that our actions have consequences, and we should seek to align ourselves with God's principles and trust in His providence rather than taking matters into our own hands. Seeking God's blessings. Jacob's desire for the blessing of his father reflects our innate longing for blessings and favor from God. As believers, we can seek God's blessings through prayer, obedience, and a genuine relationship with Him. Instead of relying on deceitful tactics, we should trust in God's timing and His plans for our lives. Remember that the story of Jacob's deception is part of a larger narrative that spans several chapters in Genesis. It serves as a backdrop for Jacob's transformation and his eventual reconciliation with Esau. As you continue reading through the book of Genesis, you will witness how God works in Jacob's life and shapes him into the patriarch of the nation of Israel. Genesis chapter 27 verse 13. And his mother said unto him, Upon me be thy curse, my son, only obey my voice, and go fetch me them. This verse is a part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the events surrounding the blessing that was meant for Esau but was deceitfully obtained by Jacob, his younger twin brother, with the help of their mother, Rebekah. In this specific verse, we witness a conversation between Jacob and his mother Rebekah. Jacob had been instructed by Rebekah to disguise himself as Esau, his older brother, in order to receive his father Isaac's blessing. Isaac, who was blind and nearing the end of his life, intended to bless Esau before his passing. Rebekah, recognizing that Jacob was favored by God and the rightful heir to the covenant promises given to Abraham, devised a plan to ensure Jacob received the blessing instead. In verse 13, Rebekah reassures Jacob and takes upon herself the responsibility for any potential curse resulting from the deception. She tells Jacob to obey her voice and fetch the necessary items to complete the disguise. This verse highlights the complexity of the situation and the lengths to which Rebekah and Jacob were willing to go in order to secure the blessing. It also raises ethical questions regarding their methods, as they resorted to deceit and manipulation. While the actions of Rebekah and Jacob may be seen as questionable, it is important to remember that God's sovereignty is at work throughout this narrative. God had previously revealed to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, indicating his plan for Jacob to receive the blessing. However, Rebekah and Jacob took matters into their own hands, attempting to fulfill God's promise through their own schemes. The story of Jacob and Esau serves as a reminder that God's purposes and plans will ultimately prevail, even in the midst of human failings and flawed actions. It also highlights the consequences of attempting to manipulate or control the fulfillment of God's promises through deceitful means. In studying this verse, we can reflect on the importance of trusting in God's timing and relying on His faithfulness rather than resorting to deceit and manipulation. It serves as a cautionary tale and reminds us to seek God's guidance and submit to His will, trusting that His plans will unfold according to His perfect wisdom. Genesis chapter 27 verse 14. And he went, and fetched, and brought him to his mother. And his mother made savory meat, such as his father loved. In this verse, we find ourselves in the narrative of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex relationship. The context of this particular passage is a pivotal event in their lives, where Jacob cunningly obtains his father Isaac's blessing, which was intended for the eldest son, Esau. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 27 verse 14, it is essential to consider the events leading up to it. Isaac, who was nearing old age and had limited vision, desired to bless his firstborn, Esau, before his impending death. Esau, a skillful hunter, was favored by Isaac due to his love for the savory wild game that Esau provided. However, Rebekah, their mother, overheard Isaac's intention to bless Esau and devised a plan to secure the blessing for Jacob, her preferred son. She instructed Jacob to bring her 2 choice young goats from their flock, which she would use to prepare a dish that imitated Esau's signature savory meal. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 14, we see Jacob following his mother's instructions, going out to fetch the young goats. He successfully brings them to his mother, who then proceeds to cook a savory meal, skillfully disguising Jacob as Esau through the use of animal skins on his hands and neck to replicate Esau's hairy appearance. This verse highlights the lengths to which Rebekah and Jacob went to deceive Isaac and obtain the coveted blessing. It underscores the significance of a father's blessing in ancient Hebrew culture, as it carried immense weight and authority, determining the inheritance and spiritual leadership of the family. However, it is crucial to note that this passage does not condone or endorse deceitful actions. Rather, it serves as a historical account, revealing the flawed and imperfect nature of the characters involved and the consequences that followed their actions. The story of Jacob and Esau continues with Isaac being tricked into blessing Jacob, thinking he is blessing Esau. When Esau discovers the deceit, he is filled with anger and vows to kill Jacob, leading to Jacob's eventual exile. This passage prompts reflection on the consequences of deceit, the importance of honesty and integrity in our relationships, and the recognition that God's purposes can be accomplished despite human failings. It also serves as a reminder that God's plan and blessings are not achieved through dishonesty but through trust and obedience to His will. Genesis chapter 27 verse 15. And Rebekah took goodly raiment of her eldest son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them upon Jacob her younger son. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. The context of this passage is important to understand the significance of what happens in verse 15. To provide some background, Isaac was an aging man and intended to bless his eldest son, Esau, before his death. However, Rebekah, their mother, had overheard Isaac's conversation with Esau and knew that Isaac intended to bless Esau before he died. Rebekah preferred Jacob to receive the blessing, so she devised a plan to deceive Isaac. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 15, Rebekah takes advantage of the fact that Esau, being a skilled hunter, had left to prepare a meal for Isaac in order to receive his father's blessing. Rebekah then goes into action to ensure that Jacob receives the blessing instead. In this verse, Rebekah takes the goodly raiment that belonged to Esau and puts them on Jacob, her younger son. Esau was known for his rugged, outdoorsy lifestyle, while Jacob was more of a homebody. The purpose of Rebekah's act was to make Jacob appear and feel like Esau so that when Isaac, who was visually impaired, touched Jacob, he would believe he was blessing Esau. This verse showcases Rebekah's cunning and her determination to manipulate the situation to her advantage. However, it also highlights the deceitful nature of Rebekah's actions. It is worth noting that Rebekah's actions were not righteous, as deception and dishonesty are not qualities that align with God's character. This passage reminds us of the consequences that can arise from human manipulation and deceit. It also serves as a reminder that our actions have repercussions, and we should strive to align ourselves with God's principles of truth, honesty, and righteousness. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 15 is a pivotal verse in the story of Jacob and Esau, illustrating Rebekah's scheme to ensure Jacob receives the blessing intended for Esau. It serves as a reminder of the importance of integrity and the potential consequences of deceptive actions. Genesis chapter 27 verse 16. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands, and upon the smooth of his neck. Genesis chapter 27 verse 16 is part of the narrative of Jacob and Rebekah's deception of Isaac in order to obtain the blessing intended for Esau, his older brother. To understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the context and the events leading up to it. In Genesis chapter 27, Isaac, who is old and blind, decides to bless his eldest son Esau before his impending death. However, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, overhears this and devises a plan to ensure that Jacob, her favorite son, receives the blessing instead. In the preceding verses, Rebekah instructs Jacob to bring 2 young goats from the flock so that she can prepare a dish to present to Isaac, mimicking Esau's hunting abilities. She also tells Jacob to put on Esau's clothing and cover his hands and neck with the skins of the goats. These actions are intended to deceive Isaac into thinking that Jacob is Esau. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 16, we see Rebekah carrying out her plan. She takes the skins of the young goats and places them on Jacob's hands and the smooth part of his neck. The significance of this action lies in the fact that Esau was known for being hairy, while Jacob was smooth-skinned. By covering Jacob's hands and neck with the goatskins, Rebekah aims to make Jacob appear like Esau to Isaac's touch. This verse highlights the lengths to which Rebekah is willing to go to ensure that Jacob receives the blessing. It underscores the deception at play and the subversion of the expected order within the family. The story of Jacob and Esau carries broader themes of favoritism, deceit, and the consequences of such actions. While Jacob's deception succeeds, it ultimately leads to a strained relationship between the brothers and the need for Jacob to flee from Esau's wrath. This incident serves as a pivotal moment in the narrative of Genesis, setting the stage for the complex dynamics within the family and the unfolding of God's plan for Jacob's life. It is important to note that while the events described in Genesis chapter 27 involve deception, the Bible presents them as part of the historical account, rather than as an endorsement of deceitful actions. The consequences of these actions are shown throughout the subsequent events in the lives of Jacob, Esau, and their descendants. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 16 captures a crucial moment in the story of Jacob and Rebekah's deception of Isaac, emphasizing the lengths to which they were willing to go to secure the blessing for Jacob. It prompts us to reflect on the implications of their actions and the broader themes of God's sovereignty, human frailty, and the consequences of our choices. Genesis chapter 27 verse 17. And she gave the savory meat and the bread, which she had prepared, into the hand of her son Jacob. This verse is part of the account of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, in order to receive the blessing intended for his older brother, Esau. To fully understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the context and the key themes present in this passage. Context: in Genesis chapter 27, we find Isaac, who is old and blind, preparing to bless his son Esau. However, Jacob, under the influence of his mother Rebekah, devises a plan to deceive his father and receive the blessing instead. Rebekah prepares a delicious meal for Isaac, and Jacob, wearing Esau's clothing, presents himself before his father, pretending to be Esau. Key themes. Deception. This passage highlights the theme of deception. Jacob, with his mother's help, disguises himself as Esau to trick his father into giving him the blessing. This act of deception will have significant consequences for Jacob and his family. Blessing. The concept of the blessing is central to this passage. In ancient times, a father's blessing held great significance, as it determined the inheritance and future prosperity of the recipient. Jacob, desiring this blessing, goes to great lengths to secure it. Obedience and trust. This passage raises questions about obedience and trust in God's plan. Rebekah believes that Jacob should receive the blessing, but instead of trusting in God's promise to make Jacob great, she resorts to deception. This lack of trust leads to a chain of events with far-reaching consequences. Lessons and application. Honesty and integrity. This passage serves as a reminder of the importance of honesty and integrity in our lives. Jacob's actions may have brought him temporary gain, but they also led to years of separation and strife within his family. We should strive to be honest and trustworthy, even when faced with difficult circumstances. Trusting in God's promises. Rebekah's lack of trust in God's promise to bless Jacob shows the dangers of taking matters into our own hands. We should have faith in God's timing and trust that His promises will be fulfilled in His way and in His time. Consequences of deception. The consequences of Jacob's deception are significant. His relationship with Esau is damaged, and he is forced to flee his home. This serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences that can arise from deceitful actions. We should always strive to live in truth and seek reconciliation when our actions have caused harm. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 17 depicts Rebekah providing Jacob with a savory meal to present to Isaac, as part of their plan to deceive Isaac and receive the blessing. This verse highlights themes of deception, the significance of blessings, and the importance of honesty and trust in God's plan. It also serves as a reminder of the consequences that can arise from deceitful actions. Genesis chapter 27 verse 18. And he came unto his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I. Who art thou, my son? This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that recounts the story of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, in order to receive his brother Esau's blessing. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 27 verse 18, it is important to examine the context of the passage. In the preceding verses, Isaac, who was old and blind, desired to bless his eldest son, Esau, before his impending death. However, Jacob and his mother, Rebekah, conspired to deceive Isaac. Jacob, with his mother's help, prepared a savory dish to imitate Esau's cooking and dressed himself in Esau's clothes to appear and feel like his hairy brother. Jacob approached his father Isaac, pretending to be Esau, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I. Who art thou, my son? Genesis chapter 27 verse 18, KJV. This verse captures Isaac's confusion as he is uncertain about the identity of the person standing before him. Isaac's eyesight was impaired due to old age, and he relied on his senses to recognize his son. Since Jacob disguised himself as Esau, Isaac's initial question, Who art thou, my son? Reveals his uncertainty and suspicion. Isaac's response demonstrates his willingness to engage with the person claiming to be Esau. He expresses his readiness to provide the blessing once he is convinced of the individual's identity. This interaction sets the stage for the subsequent events in which Jacob successfully deceives Isaac and receives the patriarchal blessing meant for Esau. The story of Jacob's deception in Genesis chapter 27 serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of deceit, as well as a demonstration of God's sovereignty in working through flawed individuals to fulfill His purposes. While Jacob's actions were deceptive and morally questionable, God had already chosen Jacob over Esau to carry on the covenantal blessings given to Abraham and Isaac. The story highlights the complexities of human nature and the overarching plan of God that transcends human weaknesses. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 18 captures Isaac's initial confusion and sets the stage for the unfolding of Jacob's deception. It invites readers to consider the implications of deceit and God's sovereignty, serving as a reminder to seek truth and trust in God's ultimate plan. Genesis chapter 27 verse 19. And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau thy firstborn. I have done according as thou badest me. Arise, I pray thee, sit and eat of my venison, that thy soul may bless me. This verse is part of the account of Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, where Jacob cunningly deceives his father Isaac to receive the blessing that was intended for Esau. Let's explore the context and key themes of this passage. Context: Isaac, being old and blind, was ready to bless his eldest son, Esau, before his death. However, Rebekah, who favored Jacob, overheard Isaac's intention and devised a plan for Jacob to receive the blessing instead. Rebekah helped Jacob prepare a meal to imitate the taste and texture of the wild game that Esau typically hunted. Deception: in this verse, we see Jacob pretending to be Esau. By disguising his identity and using Esau's name, Jacob lies to his father, claiming that he has fulfilled Isaac's instructions. Jacob's intention was to secure the blessing, which was highly significant in the culture of that time. This act of deceit reveals Jacob's ambitious and conniving nature. Blessing: in the biblical context, a father's blessing held great importance. It was more than a mere wish or prayer. It carried authority, inheritance, and spiritual significance. By receiving this blessing, the recipient would be affirmed as the chosen heir and receive God's favor and protection. The consequences: Jacob's deception had severe consequences for his relationship with Esau and the broader family dynamics. Esau, upon discovering his brother's deceit, was filled with anger and sought to kill Jacob. This deception led to a strained relationship between Jacob and Esau that lasted for years. Divine sovereignty: although Jacob used deceit to obtain the blessing, it is important to note that God's ultimate plan was to bless Jacob. God had previously revealed to Rebekah that Jacob would be the chosen one, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, and this event in Genesis chapter 27 was a means by which God's plan unfolded. However, Jacob's actions were not justified, as he relied on his own methods instead of trusting in God's promise. Lessons we can learn from Genesis chapter 27 verse 19. Honesty and integrity. This passage reminds us of the importance of honesty and integrity in our relationships. Jacob's deceit caused great harm and led to long-lasting consequences. It is crucial for us to be people of integrity and truth, even in challenging situations. Trusting God's promises. Jacob's actions demonstrate a lack of trust in God's promise to make him the chosen one. Rather than relying on his own devices, he could have waited for God's plan to unfold. We should learn to trust in God's promises and timing, even when things seem uncertain. Consequences of deceit. Jacob's deception caused division, enmity, and years of separation between him and Esau. This serves as a reminder that deceit has significant consequences, both for ourselves and those around us. We should strive to be people of truth, honesty, and love. God's sovereignty. Despite Jacob's deceit, God's plan was not thwarted. This verse highlights God's sovereignty in working out his purposes. It serves as a reminder that God can work through flawed individuals and difficult circumstances to accomplish his will. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 19 provides insights into the deceitful actions of Jacob, his deception of Isaac, and the consequences that ensued. It also serves as a reminder for us to uphold honesty, trust in God's promises, and be aware of the consequences of our actions. Genesis chapter 27 verse 20. And Isaac said unto his son, How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord thy God brought it to me. This verse is part of the account of the deception that took place between Isaac, his wife Rebekah, and their sons Jacob and Esau. Isaac, who was old and blind, intended to bless his eldest son Esau before his death. However, Rebekah, favoring Jacob, devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. In this particular verse, Isaac, who was under the impression that he was speaking to Esau, expressed surprise at how quickly the game Esau had hunted was prepared for him. He questioned Esau, asking how he managed to accomplish the task so rapidly. Esau, unaware of the deception, responded by saying that it was because the Lord thy God brought it to me. Upon a closer examination of this verse, several important aspects can be noted. Deception. This verse is part of a larger narrative that highlights the deception within Isaac's family. Rebekah and Jacob conspired to deceive Isaac, not only by disguising Jacob as Esau, but also by preparing a meal that imitated Esau's hunting skills. The entire episode reflects the consequences of dishonesty and the breakdown of trust within a family. Divine sovereignty. While Esau's response might seem puzzling, it indicates that he attributed his success in hunting to God's intervention. Despite the deceitful nature of the situation, Esau acknowledged God's role in his provision. This highlights the belief in God's sovereignty and the acknowledgement that all blessings ultimately come from Him, regardless of the circumstances or motivations of those involved. Irony. There is a certain irony in Esau's words, as he unknowingly attributes the provision of the game to the Lord, while he himself is being deceived in order to secure the blessing that rightfully belonged to him as the firstborn. This irony emphasizes the consequences of deception and the unintended outcomes that can result from our actions. Genesis chapter 27 verse 20 serves as a pivotal verse in the larger narrative of Jacob and Esau, highlighting the themes of deception, divine sovereignty, and the consequences of dishonesty. It reminds us of the importance of truthfulness, trust, and recognizing God's sovereignty in our lives, even in the midst of challenging and morally ambiguous situations. Genesis chapter 27 verse 21. And Isaac said unto Jacob, Come near, I pray thee, that I may feel thee, my son, whether thou be my very son Esau or not. Context. The story of Genesis chapter 27 revolves around the events leading up to Jacob deceiving his father Isaac in order to receive his brother Esau's blessing. Isaac was old and blind, and he desired to bless Esau, his eldest son, before his impending death. However, Jacob and his mother Rebekah devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. Symbolism of touch. In this verse, Isaac asks Jacob to come near so that he may feel him. Isaac's inability to see due to his blindness necessitated this physical interaction to confirm Jacob's identity. Touch played a significant role in biblical narratives, often symbolizing connection, confirmation, and blessing. In this context, Isaac sought to confirm Jacob's identity by touching him, as he suspected something was amiss. Deception and the consequences. This verse highlights the deceitful nature of Jacob's actions. Jacob, in collaboration with his mother, disguised himself as Esau by covering his hands and neck with animal skins to mimic his hairy brother's appearance. Jacob's intent was to deceive his father into thinking he was Esau, thereby securing the blessing intended for his brother. This act of deception led to significant consequences for Jacob and his family, including strained relationships and years of separation from his brother Esau. Lessons on honesty and integrity. The story of Jacob's deception serves as a reminder of the importance of honesty and integrity in our actions. Jacob's actions may be seen as a failure to trust in God's promises and a reliance on his own cunning. The Bible consistently encourages believers to uphold moral values, speak the truth, and trust in God's faithfulness rather than resorting to deceitful means. God's sovereignty and redemption. Despite the deceitful actions of Jacob, God's sovereign plan for him and his descendants remained intact. Jacob later experienced a transformation and became known as Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. God's redemptive plan unfolded through Jacob's lineage, ultimately leading to the birth of Jesus Christ. This reminds us that even when we make mistakes or resort to deception, God's redemptive purposes can still be fulfilled through our lives if we turn to Him in repentance and seek His forgiveness. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 21 highlights the deceitful actions of Jacob and the consequences that followed. It also provides a lesson on the importance of honesty, integrity, and trust in God's faithfulness. Despite Jacob's deception, God's sovereign plan was not thwarted, underscoring His ability to redeem and work through flawed individuals. Genesis chapter 27 verse 22. And Jacob went near unto Isaac his father, and he felt him, and said, The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Context: the story of Genesis chapter 27 revolves around Isaac, the son of Abraham, nearing the end of his life and wanting to bless his eldest son, Esau. However, Jacob, the younger son, and his mother Rebekah devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob instead. In this particular verse, Jacob has approached Isaac, disguised as Esau, to receive the blessing. Deception and consequences. This verse highlights the deceptive nature of Jacob's actions. Although Jacob successfully disguised himself as Esau, Isaac was initially suspicious. He recognized Jacob's voice but noticed that the hands he felt belonged to Esau, who was known for his hairy appearance. Jacob's act of deception carried consequences not only for himself but for his family as well. God's sovereignty. While Jacob's actions were deceitful, it is important to note that God's sovereignty was at work in the broader narrative. God had already indicated that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, suggesting that the blessing was meant for Jacob rather than Esau. This verse serves as a pivotal moment in fulfilling God's plan, as the blessing intended for Esau is bestowed upon Jacob. Human flaws and God's redemptive work. The story of Jacob and Esau illustrates the flawed nature of human beings. Jacob's deception and Esau's rash decisions demonstrate the fallenness of humanity. However, God's redemptive work is evident throughout the narrative, as He continues to use imperfect individuals to fulfill His purposes. Jacob's journey eventually leads to transformation and reconciliation with his brother Esau, showcasing God's grace and ability to bring about good even from flawed situations. Lessons for today. The story of Jacob and Esau reminds us of the importance of integrity, honesty, and patience. Jacob's impatience and willingness to deceive had significant consequences for himself and his family. As believers, we should strive to trust in God's timing and rely on His guidance rather than resorting to deceitful means to achieve our desires. It is a reminder that God's purposes will ultimately prevail, and our responsibility is to walk in obedience and trust Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 22 portrays Jacob's deceptive act of disguising himself as Esau to receive his father's blessing. This verse highlights the consequences of Jacob's actions, God's sovereignty in fulfilling His plan, the fallenness of humanity, and the importance of integrity and trust in God. Genesis chapter 27 verse 23. And he discerned him not because his hands were hairy, as his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. Genesis chapter 27 verse 23 is a part of the well-known story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex relationship and struggled for their father's blessing. In this particular verse, Isaac, their father, is nearing old age and is blind. He wishes to give his blessing to his eldest son, Esau, before he dies. However, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, deceives Isaac and receives the blessing meant for Esau. There are a few key points we can extract from this verse. Deception and its consequences. The verse highlights the deceitful actions of Jacob. In an attempt to receive his father's blessing, Jacob disguises himself as his hairy brother Esau by covering his hands and neck with animal skins. Isaac, being blind, does not recognize the deception and is fooled into thinking that Jacob is Esau. This act of deception has significant consequences, as it leads to conflict and strained relationships within the family. The importance of the blessing. In biblical times, a father's blessing carried great weight and was considered a significant inheritance. It often determined the future roles and responsibilities of the children within the family. In this case, the blessing was intended for Esau, the eldest son, according to the cultural norms of that time. However, Jacob's actions led to him receiving the blessing instead, leading to a reversal of the expected order and creating tension between the brothers. God's sovereignty and fulfillment of prophecy. Despite the deceitful actions involved in this verse, it is essential to recognize that God's sovereignty is at work throughout the story. Prior to their birth, God had prophesied that the older son, Esau, would serve the younger son, Jacob. Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. Jacob's actions, while morally questionable, become a means for God to fulfill his divine plan. This demonstrates that even in imperfect human situations, God's ultimate purposes can still be accomplished. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 23 serves as a reminder of the consequences of deceit and the sovereignty of God. It emphasizes the importance of honesty, integrity, and seeking God's will in our actions. The story of Jacob and Esau continues to unfold, teaching us valuable lessons about family dynamics, God's faithfulness, and the consequences of our choices. Genesis chapter 27 verse 24. And he said, Art thou my very son Esau? And he said, I am. This verse is part of the account of Jacob deceiving his father Isaac in order to receive the blessing that was meant for his older brother, Esau. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse within the larger narrative. Context: in Genesis chapter 27, Isaac, who was advanced in age and nearly blind, desired to bless his eldest son, Esau, before his death. However, Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother, overheard Isaac's intention and devised a plan to secure the blessing for Jacob, who was her favorite son. Deception and disguise. Knowing that Isaac's blindness prevented him from distinguishing between Jacob and Esau, Rebekah dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes and put goatskin on his hands and neck to simulate Esau's hairy appearance. When Jacob entered Isaac's presence, Isaac questioned his identity, asking if he was truly Esau. Jacob's response. In verse 24, Isaac asks Jacob directly, Art thou my very son Esau? Jacob responds, I am. This answer was intentionally deceptive, as Jacob sought to deceive his father into believing that he was Esau, thus securing the blessing meant for his brother. Implications. Jacob's response reveals his willingness to deceive and manipulate in order to obtain the blessing. Although the deception was orchestrated by Rebekah, Jacob willingly went along with the plan, disregarding the ethical implications of his actions. Consequences. The events that follow this deception have far-reaching consequences for Jacob's life. Jacob receives the blessing from Isaac, but it leads to a deep rift between him and Esau, resulting in Jacob fleeing from Esau's anger and spending many years in exile. Lessons to consider. Honesty and integrity. This passage highlights the importance of honesty and integrity in our relationships. Jacob's deception had long-lasting consequences and strained his relationship with his brother. As believers, we are called to be people of truth and integrity, upholding the principles of honesty and trustworthiness. Trusting God's promises. Although Jacob's actions were deceitful, it is important to note that God's plan and promises were not thwarted by Jacob's scheming. In subsequent chapters, we see how God works through Jacob's life, molding and transforming him into a better person. This reminds us that God's plans are not dependent on human manipulation but are ultimately fulfilled according to his purposes. Redemption and growth. Despite the initial deception, Jacob eventually experiences a transformation in his character, symbolized by his encounter with God at Peniel, Genesis chapter 32 verses 22 through 32. Through this encounter, Jacob wrestles with God and emerges with a new name, Israel, signifying his transformation and the beginning of a new chapter in his life. This demonstrates God's ability to redeem and shape the lives of flawed individuals, bringing about growth and change. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 24 reveals the deceptive actions of Jacob as he obtains the blessing meant for Esau. This passage reminds us of the importance of honesty, integrity, and trust in our relationships. It also highlights God's sovereignty in working through imperfect individuals and ultimately bringing about redemption and growth. Genesis chapter 27 verse 25. And he said, Bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's venison, that my soul may bless thee. And he brought it near to him, and he did eat, and he brought him wine, and he drank. This verse is part of the account of Jacob deceiving his father Isaac in order to receive his father's blessing. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse within the larger narrative of Genesis chapter 27. The story of Genesis chapter 27 revolves around Isaac, the son of Abraham, who is old and nearing the end of his life. Isaac intends to bless his firstborn son Esau before his death, as was the customary practice of passing on blessings and inheritance within the family. However, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard Isaac's intention and devised a plan to ensure that Jacob, their younger son, would receive the blessing instead. In this particular verse, we see the unfolding of Rebekah's plan. Rebekah had prepared a savory dish using young goats, which was one of Esau's specialties. Jacob, at his mother's behest, disguises himself as Esau by covering his arms and neck with animal skins, to imitate his hairy brother. Isaac, whose eyesight had deteriorated due to his old age, is deceived by the disguise and mistakes Jacob for Esau. Isaac requests the dish to be brought near to him, implying that he wants to eat it before bestowing his blessing. Here, we witness Isaac's intention to bless his son, believing him to be Esau. By eating the food, Isaac fulfills a customary ritual that would typically precede the act of blessing. Jacob complies with his father's request, bringing the food to Isaac, who eats it. Additionally, Jacob brings wine to Isaac, and he drinks it. Wine has historically been associated with celebration and joyous occasions in biblical times. The inclusion of wine in this scene further enhances the atmosphere of festivity surrounding the anticipated blessing. It is important to note that this passage raises ethical questions due to the deception and manipulation employed by Rebekah and Jacob to obtain the blessing. Deception was not in accordance with God's plan for the family, and it created strife and division between the brothers Jacob and Esau, leading to significant consequences in their future relationship. The story of Jacob and Esau serves as a reminder of the consequences that can arise from deceit and manipulation, highlighting the importance of honesty and integrity within relationships and families. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 25 portrays a pivotal moment in the narrative, where Isaac unknowingly blesses Jacob instead of Esau due to the deception orchestrated by Rebekah and Jacob. This act sets in motion a series of events that shape the future of Jacob and Esau's lives, illustrating the power of choices and the consequences they can bring. Genesis chapter 27 verse 26. And his father Isaac said unto him, Come near now, and kiss me, my son. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob's deception of his father Isaac to receive the blessing that was meant for his older brother Esau. In order to understand the significance of this verse, it is important to have some background context. Isaac, the son of Abraham and the father of Jacob and Esau, was old and nearing the end of his life. He had grown blind and called his eldest son Esau to prepare a meal for him before giving him his final blessing, which was traditionally given to the firstborn. Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother, overheard Isaac's instructions and devised a plan to ensure that Jacob, her favorite son, would receive the blessing instead of Esau. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes and covered his hands and neck with goatskins to mimic Esau's hairiness. She then prepared a meal for Isaac, which Jacob brought to his father. When Jacob approached Isaac, the blind patriarch became suspicious and questioned his identity. In response, Jacob said, I am Esau, thy firstborn, Genesis chapter 27 verse 19, KJV. Isaac, still uncertain, asked Jacob to come near and kiss him so he could verify if he was indeed Esau. The act of kissing was a customary expression of affection and respect within the family. In this context, Isaac's request for Jacob to come near and kiss him served two purposes. Firstly, it allowed Isaac to identify Jacob by his voice and scent, as Esau was a hairy man while Jacob was smooth-skinned. Secondly, it demonstrated the father's desire to bestow the blessing on his favored son, as Isaac had a preference for Esau due to his love for his hunting abilities and his taste for wild game. Isaac's request for a kiss also reveals the depth of the deception taking place. Jacob, under his mother's guidance, was attempting to deceive his father by pretending to be Esau in order to secure the blessing for himself. By complying with Isaac's request and kissing him, Jacob sought to further convince his father of his false identity. The narrative of Genesis chapter 27 verse 26 illustrates the intricate web of deception and family dynamics at play in this particular situation. It highlights the lengths to which Rebekah and Jacob were willing to go to ensure that Jacob received the blessing meant for the firstborn. This act of deceit had significant consequences for both Jacob and Esau, as it strained their relationship and caused them years of tension and conflict. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 26 serves as a pivotal moment in the larger story of Jacob and Esau, showcasing the intricate nature of human relationships, the consequences of deception, and the importance of familial blessings in the biblical context. Genesis chapter 27 verse 27, "And he came near, and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his raiment, and blessed him, and said, See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed." This verse captures a significant moment in the story when Jacob, pretending to be Esau, approaches his father Isaac. Let's explore the context and the deeper meaning of this verse. In the preceding verses, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, devises a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob. Rebekah instructs Jacob to bring 2 young goats, which she prepares as a meal for Isaac, imitating Esau's favored game. Jacob also puts on Esau's clothes and covers his hands and neck with animal skins to simulate Esau's hairy appearance. When Jacob approaches Isaac, the aging patriarch senses something amiss. His voice sounds like Jacob's, but his hands feel hairy like Esau's. However, the sense of smell becomes a crucial factor in Isaac's decision. As he draws near and kisses Jacob, he detects the aroma of Esau's clothing, which carries the scent of the outdoors, reminiscent of a field blessed by the Lord. Isaac's sense of smell plays a symbolic role in this narrative. Smell often conveys an association with purity, blessing, and life. In this case, Isaac perceives the smell of the field as the aroma of divine favor, representing God's blessing. This olfactory experience seems to confirm Isaac's belief that he is indeed blessing Esau, his favored son. There are a few noteworthy elements to consider in this verse. Deception and consequences. Genesis chapter 27 reveals the grave consequences of Jacob and Rebekah's deception. Although Jacob eventually receives the blessing, the deceit sows discord and leads to a strained relationship between Jacob and Esau. It demonstrates the importance of honesty and integrity in our actions. God's sovereignty. Despite the deception, God's sovereign plan remains in motion. In Genesis chapter 23 verse 23, God had revealed to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, indicating that Jacob would play a significant role in his divine purposes. While the means Jacob employs to receive the blessing are questionable, God's plan ultimately unfolds through him. Blessings and divine favor. Isaac's blessing carries immense significance in the biblical narrative, as it holds the potential for prosperity, leadership, and the passing down of the covenant promises. Although obtained deceitfully, the blessing Jacob receives foreshadows the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham and demonstrates his faithfulness, despite human shortcomings. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 27 portrays a critical moment of deception and the use of sensory cues, particularly smell, to affirm Isaac's decision to bless Jacob. This verse reminds us of the consequences of deceitful actions while showcasing God's ability to work through imperfect circumstances to accomplish his purposes. Genesis chapter 27 verse 28. Therefore God give thee of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, in order to receive the blessing intended for his brother, Esau. Jacob disguised himself as Esau and presented himself before his aging father to receive the patriarchal blessing. When Isaac realized that he had been deceived and had mistakenly blessed Jacob instead of Esau, he acknowledged that Jacob would indeed be blessed. Genesis chapter 27 verse 28 represents Isaac's pronouncement of blessings upon Jacob. Let's dive into the verse and explore its significance. Therefore God give thee. Isaac begins by acknowledging that it is God who ultimately grants blessings. He attributes the blessings he is about to bestow on Jacob to God. This shows Isaac's understanding that God's favor is essential in receiving blessings. Of the dew of heaven, the dew is a symbol of refreshment and blessing. Isaac is invoking God's provision and sustenance that comes from above. The reference to the dew of heaven indicates that Jacob will receive blessings from the divine realm. And the fatness of the earth, the fatness, here refers to the richness and fertility of the land. It suggests that Jacob will receive abundant provisions from the earth. This blessing encompasses material blessings such as prosperity, abundance, and fertility. And plenty of corn and wine. Corn and wine were staple provisions in ancient times and represented prosperity and joy. The mention of plenty signifies an abundance of these essential resources. This part of the blessing suggests that Jacob will enjoy material prosperity and abundance in his life. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 28 reflects the acknowledgement of divine blessings and the anticipation of God's provision and abundance in Jacob's life. It highlights the significance of God's involvement in granting blessings and the belief that material prosperity and abundance come from His hand. Genesis chapter 27 verse 29. Let peoples serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. Context: Genesis chapter 27 records the story of Jacob deceiving his father Isaac to receive the blessing intended for his older brother Esau. Isaac was old and blind, and he intended to bless Esau before he died. However, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, disguised himself as Esau and received the blessing from Isaac. The blessing, in this verse, Isaac pronounces a blessing upon Jacob, believing him to be Esau. The blessing contains several elements. Dominion and servitude. Isaac speaks of people serving Jacob and nations bowing down to him. This indicates that Jacob would have a position of authority and power over others. It foretells his future prominence and the establishment of the nation of Israel. Authority over his brethren. Isaac also blesses Jacob with authority over his brothers. This prophecy is fulfilled in Jacob's descendants, particularly the 12 tribes of Israel, who become a distinct and powerful nation. Curses and blessings. Isaac declares a curse upon those who curse Jacob and a blessing upon those who bless him. This implies that anyone who opposes or mistreats Jacob or his descendants will face consequences, while those who support and bless them will be blessed in return. Spiritual significance. Beyond the immediate historical context, this verse carries spiritual significance for believers today. God's sovereign plan. The fulfillment of Isaac's blessing highlights God's sovereignty and His ability to accomplish His purposes despite human frailty and deception. God's plan for Jacob to become the recipient of the blessing was ultimately fulfilled, illustrating His control over history. God's promises. The blessing given to Jacob echoes the promises made by God to Abraham and Isaac regarding the future of their descendants. It reinforces the covenant and assures the continuation of God's plan for redemption through the lineage of Abraham. Blessing and cursing. The principle of blessing and cursing remains relevant in the lives of believers today. Scripture teaches that those who bless God's people will be blessed, while those who oppose or mistreat them will face consequences. This principle can be understood in terms of the spiritual blessings and curses that result from our attitudes and actions toward God and His people. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 29 records the blessing Isaac pronounced upon Jacob, unaware that he was blessing the wrong son. This verse speaks to the future prominence, authority, and blessings that Jacob, later renamed Israel, and his descendants would receive. It also carries spiritual significance, highlighting God's sovereignty, His faithfulness to His promises, and the principles of blessing and cursing that remain relevant today. Genesis chapter 27 verse 30. And it came to pass, as soon as Isaac had made an end of blessing Jacob, and Jacob was yet scarce gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the events surrounding the blessing of Jacob by his father Isaac. It is a significant moment in the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers with a complex relationship. In the preceding verses, Jacob, at the urging of his mother Rebekah, disguises himself as Esau to receive the blessing that Isaac intended for his older son. Isaac, who is old and blind, had asked Esau to go out hunting and prepare a meal for him, after which he would bless him. However, Rebekah, overhearing this conversation, devises a plan for Jacob to receive the blessing instead. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 30, the scene unfolds immediately after Jacob receives the blessing from Isaac, who mistakenly believes he is Esau. As Jacob leaves his father's presence, Esau returns from his hunting excursion. The timing is such that Esau arrives just as Jacob is leaving, unaware of what has transpired. This verse highlights the irony and tension in the story. Jacob, having obtained the blessing deceitfully, barely escapes the presence of Isaac before Esau arrives. It sets the stage for the subsequent events that follow, as Esau discovers that his blessing has been given to Jacob and confronts his father. This passage raises important themes such as deception, parental favoritism, and the consequences of one's actions. It serves as a reminder of the significance of honesty and integrity within family relationships. The story of Jacob and Esau continues to unfold, ultimately leading to their reconciliation many years later. It is worth noting that while the events described in this passage highlight human flaws and the consequences of deceit, the overarching narrative of Genesis portrays God's sovereignty and His ability to work through imperfect individuals to accomplish His purposes. The story of Jacob and Esau is part of God's larger plan for the nation of Israel and the lineage through which the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come. By studying and reflecting upon passages like Genesis chapter 27 verse 30, we can gain insights into human nature, the consequences of our actions, and the faithfulness and sovereignty of God in the midst of our imperfections. Genesis chapter 27 verse 31. And he also had made savory meat, and brought it unto his father, and said unto his father, Let my father arise, and eat of his son's venison, that thy soul may bless me. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, in order to receive the blessing that was intended for his older brother, Esau. To understand the context of this verse, let's briefly review the story leading up to it. Isaac, who was old and blind, wanted to bless his elder son, Esau, before he died. However, Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother, overheard Isaac's plan and devised a plan of her own to ensure Jacob received the blessing instead. She instructed Jacob to bring her 2 choice young goats from the flock, and she would prepare them as a savory meal for Isaac, just as he liked it. Jacob was hesitant at first, but Rebekah assured him that she would take responsibility for any consequences that may arise. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 31, Jacob follows his mother's instructions and presents the savory meat to his father, pretending to be Esau. He approaches Isaac and urges him to rise and eat of his son's venison so that his soul may bless him. Jacob is intentionally deceiving his father by disguising himself as Esau, as Isaac's sense of touch and hearing are used to confirm his identity. It is important to note that this act of deception by Jacob raises ethical questions and demonstrates the consequences of his actions. Jacob's actions went against the principles of honesty and integrity, and it had significant repercussions for his relationships and future events in his life. Jacob's deceit ultimately led to strained relationships with his brother Esau, as well as years of separation and hardship for himself. However, it is essential to understand that the Bible does not condone or promote deception. The story of Jacob's deception serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating the negative consequences of dishonesty and manipulation. It reminds us of the importance of integrity and truthfulness in our actions and relationships. In later chapters of Genesis, we see Jacob facing the consequences of his deceit, as he himself is deceived by Laban, his uncle, when he desires to marry Rachel but is given Leah instead. Through these experiences, Jacob learns valuable lessons about the consequences of his own actions and eventually undergoes a transformation that leads to reconciliation with Esau and a closer relationship with God. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 31 portrays Jacob's act of deception as he presents the savory meat to his father, pretending to be Esau. However, this verse serves as a reminder of the negative consequences that can result from deceit and highlights the importance of honesty and integrity in our lives. Genesis chapter 27 verse 32. And Isaac his father said unto him, Who art thou? And he said, I am thy son, thy firstborn Esau. This verse is part of the account of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers and sons of Isaac and Rebekah. The context of Genesis chapter 27 is significant in understanding the events leading up to this verse. Isaac, who was advanced in age and nearly blind, intended to bless his eldest son Esau before his impending death. However, Rebekah, who favored Jacob, devised a plan to secure the blessing for him instead. In the preceding verses, Jacob disguised himself as Esau by wearing Esau's clothes and covering his hands and neck with goatskin to imitate Esau's hairy appearance. He then brought a savory meal to his father, pretending to be Esau, and sought the blessing that rightfully belonged to Esau as the firstborn. When Isaac questioned Jacob, Who art thou? Jacob responded, I am thy son, thy firstborn Esau. Here, Jacob lied to his father, intentionally deceiving him to obtain the blessing. Isaac, due to his visual impairment, was unable to discern the truth, and he proceeded to bless Jacob, believing he was blessing Esau. This incident raises several moral and ethical considerations. Firstly, it highlights the negative consequences of favoritism within a family. Rebekah's partiality toward Jacob and Isaac's preference for Esau created an environment of competition and deception, leading to the deception that occurred in this passage. Secondly, it demonstrates the consequences of dishonesty and the potential harm that can arise from lying. Jacob's decision to deceive his father had far-reaching consequences for his relationship with Esau and the subsequent events in their lives. It resulted in significant family conflict and a fractured relationship between the brothers. While this passage portrays deception and the consequences it brings, it is important to note that deception is not condoned or endorsed by the Bible. Rather, it serves as a cautionary example, reminding us of the need for honesty, integrity, and respect within our relationships and families. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 32 in the KJV describes Jacob's deceitful act of impersonating his brother Esau to obtain his father's blessing. This verse underscores the negative consequences of favoritism, dishonesty, and the potential harm caused by deception within families. It serves as a reminder of the importance of integrity and the need to foster healthy relationships built on trust and honesty. Genesis chapter 27 verse 33. And Isaac trembled very exceedingly, and said, Where is he that hath taken venison, and brought it me? And I have eaten of all before thou camest, and have blessed him. Yea, and he shall be blessed. This verse comes in the context of a pivotal moment in the story, where Jacob, at the advice of his mother Rebekah, deceived his father Isaac in order to receive his blessing. Isaac, who was elderly and blind, intended to bless his older son Esau, but Jacob disguised himself as Esau and received the blessing instead. Let's explore some key aspects of this verse and its broader implications. Deception and consequences. The verse reveals Isaac's realization that he has been deceived. He trembles and is deeply disturbed upon discovering that he has inadvertently blessed Jacob instead of Esau. This incident highlights the consequences of deception and the weight of words and actions. Deception not only affects the deceived but also has a lasting impact on relationships and family dynamics. Divine sovereignty. Despite Jacob's deceptive actions, it is worth noting that God's sovereign plan is at work in this narrative. In Genesis chapter 25 verse 23, before the twins were born, God revealed to Rebekah that the older son would serve the younger. This means that God's plan to continue his covenant through Jacob, rather than Esau, was already established. Although Jacob's methods were deceitful, God's purpose was ultimately fulfilled through him. Blessings and birthright. Isaac acknowledges that he has already given Jacob his blessing and pronounces that Jacob will indeed be blessed. The blessing given by Isaac was a significant pronouncement that carried spiritual and material implications. It was a transfer of the covenantal blessings that had been promised to Abraham and passed down through Isaac. Jacob, through his deception, received the birthright and the accompanying responsibilities and blessings. Irony and dramatic irony. This verse also contains elements of irony and dramatic irony. Isaac asks, Where is he that hath taken venison, and brought it me? Unknowingly referring to Jacob himself. This irony adds a layer of tension and drama to the story, as the reader is aware of Jacob's identity while Isaac remains unaware. This verse serves as a crucial turning point in the story of Jacob and Esau, setting in motion a series of events that shape their lives and relationships. It reminds us of the consequences of deceit and the importance of honesty and integrity in our interactions with others. It also highlights God's sovereignty and his ability to work through imperfect and deceptive individuals to accomplish his purposes. Genesis chapter 27 verse 34. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great and exceeding bitter cry, and said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. Context. The passage is part of the narrative of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complicated relationship. In this particular scene, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, had deceived his elderly father Isaac into receiving the blessing intended for Esau, the firstborn son. Esau, upon discovering the deception, reacts with anguish and appeals to his father for a blessing. Emotional response. Esau's reaction reveals the depth of his emotions. He cries out with a great and exceeding bitter cry, expressing his intense grief, disappointment, and desperation. Esau realizes the significance of the blessing he has lost, as it carried with it a special spiritual and material inheritance. Consequences of impulsive actions. Esau's cry signifies the consequence of his own impulsive actions. Earlier, Esau had despised his birthright and sold it to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew, Genesis chapter 25 verses 29 through 34. Now, he is confronted with the weight of his choices and the irreversible consequences of his impulsiveness. Reflection on God's sovereignty. This passage prompts us to reflect on God's sovereignty and how he works even in situations where human actions bring about unintended consequences. God had already prophesied to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. Jacob's deception becomes a means by which God's plan is fulfilled, though it is not a commendable action on Jacob's part. Lessons on family relationships. The account of Jacob and Esau serves as a cautionary tale regarding family relationships and the negative consequences that can arise from favoritism, deceit, and manipulation. It highlights the importance of trust, open communication, and treating one another with fairness and respect within families. Repentance and forgiveness. Esau's cry demonstrates his deep desire for a blessing, indicating a sense of remorse and recognition of his own actions. While he does not receive the original blessing, in later encounters with Jacob, Esau demonstrates forgiveness and reconciliation, Genesis chapter 33 verses 1 through 11. This teaches us the importance of repentance and forgiveness in healing fractured relationships. Application to our lives. The story of Esau's cry challenges us to consider the consequences of our own impulsive actions and decisions. It encourages us to value what is truly important, such as our relationship with God and our relationships with others. It also prompts us to seek reconciliation and forgiveness when relationships are strained or broken. Remember that studying the Bible involves reading the passage in its broader context and considering the message it conveys within the framework of the entire biblical narrative. Genesis chapter 27 verse 35. And he said, Thy brother came with subtlety, and hath taken away thy blessing. This verse is part of the account of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, in order to obtain his brother Esau's blessing. To understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the context and the implications of Jacob's actions. In the preceding verses, we learn that Isaac, who was nearing the end of his life and had become blind, wanted to bless his eldest son, Esau. Traditionally, the blessing was a significant act performed by a father to confer spiritual authority, leadership, and inheritance to his chosen son. Isaac called for Esau and requested him to hunt game and prepare a meal so that he could bless him afterward. However, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, deceived his father by disguising himself as Esau. Jacob brought a savory meal to Isaac, who was unable to see clearly, and received the blessing intended for Esau. When Esau arrived later with his prepared meal, he discovered that his brother Jacob had already received their father's blessing. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 35, Esau expresses his distress upon realizing what had happened. He accuses his brother Jacob of deceit, stating that Jacob came with subtlety and took away his blessing. This verse captures Esau's anguish and betrayal, as he understands that the blessing he had eagerly anticipated and considered his rightful inheritance had been snatched away from him. This event in Genesis chapter 27 verse 35 carries significant consequences throughout the biblical narrative. Esau's anger towards Jacob prompts him to plan revenge and leads to a long-standing conflict between their descendants, the Edomites, Esau's descendants, and the Israelites, Jacob's descendants. Additionally, this incident highlights the theme of deceit and the consequences that can arise from dishonesty. While Jacob's actions may seem deceitful, it's important to note that God's plan to bless Jacob, as previously revealed to his mother Rebekah, was ultimately fulfilled through this event. Nevertheless, Jacob also faced consequences for his actions, including being separated from his family for a considerable period. This episode serves as a reminder of the human frailty and the need for integrity in our dealings with others. It teaches us the importance of honesty, the potential consequences of deception, and the necessity of seeking God's guidance and trusting in His promises rather than resorting to deceitful means to achieve our goals. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 35 captures Esau's anguish and accusation towards Jacob for deceitfully taking away his blessing. This verse reminds us of the consequences of deception and emphasizes the importance of honesty and integrity in our relationships with others. Genesis chapter 27 verse 36. And he said, Is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and, behold, now he hath taken away my blessing. And he said, Hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex relationship. It highlights the moment when Esau realizes that Jacob has deceived their father, Isaac, and received the blessing that was intended for Esau as the firstborn. To understand the context and significance of this verse, let's explore the preceding events in Genesis chapter 27. Isaac, their father, was old and his eyesight had become weak. Sensing his impending death, Isaac wanted to bless Esau, his favorite son, before he passed away. However, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, plotted to receive the blessing instead. Rebekah was aware of God's prophecy that the older son would serve the younger, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. She favored Jacob and encouraged him to disguise himself as Esau and bring their father a meal, so he would mistakenly bless Jacob. Jacob, though hesitant, followed his mother's instructions, and Isaac was deceived into blessing him, believing him to be Esau. When Esau learned of Jacob's deceit, he was overwhelmed with grief and anger. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 36, Esau confronts his father with his frustration, expressing his deep sense of betrayal. Esau feels that Jacob has supplanted him, taking both his birthright and now his blessing. First, Jacob had taken Esau's birthright in an earlier incident, Genesis chapter 25 verses 29 through 34. Esau, being famished after hunting, sold his birthright to Jacob in exchange for a bowl of lentil stew. This birthright included the privileges and responsibilities of the firstborn, such as receiving a double portion of the inheritance and assuming the role of leadership within the family. Now, Esau realizes that not only has Jacob obtained the birthright, but he has also cunningly acquired the blessing that rightfully belonged to Esau. The blessing held great significance, as it was believed to confer God's favor and ensure prosperity, leadership, and the fulfillment of God's promises. Esau's plea at the end of the verse, "Hast thou not reserved a blessing for me?" reveals his desperation and hope that his father may still have a blessing left for him, even though the primary blessing has been given to Jacob. This passage raises important themes such as the consequences of deception and manipulation, the tension between God's sovereign plan and human choices, and the struggle between siblings. It shows how the consequences of their actions affect both Jacob and Esau, leading to a strained relationship that continues throughout their lives. In later biblical accounts, we see that Esau eventually forgives Jacob, and they reconcile, Genesis chapter 33. The story of Jacob and Esau reminds us of the complexity of human relationships and the importance of honesty, forgiveness, and seeking reconciliation when conflicts arise. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 36 offers a glimpse into the turbulent relationship between Jacob and Esau, emphasizing the consequences of deception and the emotional turmoil experienced by Esau upon discovering that his brother has taken both his birthright and his blessing. Genesis chapter 27 verse 37. And Isaac answered and said unto Esau, Behold, I have made him thy lord, and all his brethren have I given to him for servants, and with corn and wine have I sustained him. And what shall I do now unto thee, my son? This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. The context of this verse is important to understand its significance. In the preceding verses, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, deceived his father Isaac in order to obtain the blessing that was traditionally given to the eldest son, Esau. Esau, who was the firstborn, had already sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew, and now the blessing, which included the inheritance of their father's possessions and a special divine favor, had been given to Jacob instead. When Esau discovered what had happened, he was distraught and filled with anger. In Genesis chapter 27 verses 34 through 36, we see Esau pleading with his father to bless him as well, but Isaac explains that he has already given everything to Jacob. Then comes Genesis chapter 27 verse 37, where Isaac further elaborates on the situation. Isaac acknowledges that he has made Jacob Esau's lord, and he has given Jacob's brothers as servants to him. He mentions that he has sustained Jacob with provisions of corn and wine. Isaac is essentially conveying to Esau that he has already bestowed great blessings and privileges upon Jacob, leaving little or nothing to give to Esau. This verse highlights the consequences of Esau's previous actions. By selling his birthright, which represented his position as the firstborn and the associated privileges, Esau had relinquished his rights and authority within the family. Now, the blessings and inheritance that Isaac had intended for Esau have been transferred to Jacob. Isaac's words reflect the irreversible nature of his decision and express his uncertainty regarding what more he can do for Esau. This passage serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of valuing and respecting our inheritance and birthright. Esau's impulsive and short-sighted decision had long-lasting ramifications for his life. It reminds us to be thoughtful and considerate in our choices, particularly regarding matters of great significance. Furthermore, this episode also reveals the sovereignty of God in the affairs of humanity. Despite Jacob's deceptive actions, God had foreseen the future and chosen Jacob to fulfill his divine purposes. The story of Jacob and Esau illustrates how God's plans and promises prevail even in the midst of human failings and shortcomings. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 27 verse 37 showcases the aftermath of Jacob obtaining the blessing meant for Esau. It reveals the irreversible consequences of Esau's previous actions and highlights the importance of valuing and respecting our inheritances. It also underscores the sovereignty of God in working out His purposes in the lives of individuals and the world. Genesis chapter 27 verse 38. And Esau said unto his father, Hast thou but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice, and wept. This verse is part of the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex and tumultuous relationship. In this particular incident, Jacob, with the help of their mother Rebekah, deceived their blind father Isaac and obtained the blessing that was originally meant for Esau, the eldest son. When Esau discovered this, he was deeply distressed and pleaded with his father for a blessing as well. This verse reflects the deep emotional turmoil experienced by Esau upon realizing that the blessing, which held great significance in their culture, had been taken away from him. It reveals his genuine sorrow and desperation as he wept and sought his father's favor. Esau's reaction highlights the significance of blessings in their society and the gravity of the loss he felt. From a broader perspective, this incident and Esau's response demonstrate the consequences of Jacob's deceit and the brokenness within their family. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of deception and the importance of integrity in relationships. Additionally, this verse can prompt us to consider the theme of God's sovereignty and His ability to work even in difficult situations. Although Esau's blessing was given to Jacob, later narratives in the Bible show that God still had a plan for Esau and his descendants. Despite the pain and disappointment Esau experienced in this moment, God's ultimate purposes would unfold in his life. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 38 serves as a reminder of the complexities of human relationships, the consequences of our actions, and the overarching sovereignty of God in the midst of challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 27 verse 39. And Isaac his father answered and said unto him, Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. In this particular scene, Jacob had deceived his father Isaac and received the blessing that was intended for Esau, the older son. When Esau realized what had happened, he pleaded with his father for a blessing of his own. Let's examine this verse and its context to gain a deeper understanding. The blessing. In ancient times, a father's blessing carried significant weight and had profound implications for the recipient. It was a prophetic declaration of favor, prosperity, and divine protection. Isaac's response to Esau's request is a form of blessing. Thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth. This phrase implies that Esau would enjoy a fertile and prosperous land, with an abundance of resources and blessings. It suggests material prosperity, agricultural abundance, and physical well-being. Esau's descendants, the Edomites, did indeed inherit a region with rich soil and favorable conditions for agriculture. And of the dew of heaven from above, this phrase symbolizes the provision of God from above. Dew was crucial in an arid climate like the Middle East, where it would settle on plants during the night and provide essential moisture. This part of the blessing indicates that Esau's blessings would also come from God's provision and divine favor. Symbolic meaning. Beyond its literal meaning, this verse carries symbolic significance. Esau's blessings represent earthly abundance and physical prosperity. However, the emphasis on material wealth in this verse should not be seen as an endorsement or approval of Esau's character or choices. It highlights God's faithfulness to bless and provide for His people, even when they fall short. Esau's character. It is important to note that Esau, throughout his life, displayed a disregard for his birthright and spiritual heritage. He sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. Genesis chapter 25 verses 29 through 34. Esau's priorities were focused on immediate gratification rather than the spiritual blessings associated with the birthright. Consequently, although Esau received a blessing, it was not the primary blessing intended for him. Divine providence. Despite Jacob's deception, God's providence is evident throughout this narrative. The ultimate purpose of the blessing was to fulfill God's plan and promise of establishing His chosen people through Jacob's line. God's sovereignty is seen in the way He works through imperfect individuals and circumstances to bring about His purposes. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 39 conveys the material blessings and prosperity that Esau would receive as part of his father's blessing. However, it also serves as a reminder that God's blessings extend beyond material wealth and encompass spiritual fulfillment and His divine provision. The passage highlights God's faithfulness and His ability to work through flawed individuals and circumstances to bring about His sovereign plan. Genesis chapter 27 verse 40. And by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother, and it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, are dealing with the consequences of Jacob's deception in obtaining his father's blessing. In this particular verse, Isaac is pronouncing a blessing upon Esau, the older brother. Let's break down the verse and explore its meaning. And by thy sword shalt thou live. This phrase suggests that Esau's descendants would be a warrior-like people, relying on their strength and skill in warfare for survival. It implies a life characterized by conflict and perhaps a more nomadic or hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And shalt serve thy brother. This part of the verse predicts that Esau and his descendants would eventually serve Jacob and his descendants. This aspect of the blessing finds fulfillment in the historical context of the Israelites, who descended from Jacob and became a nation with the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, eventually being subjugated to them at various points. And it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion. This phrase indicates that there will be a time when Esau's descendants would have the opportunity to break free from the dominance of Jacob's descendants and exert their own power and influence. That thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. This part of the verse suggests that when Esau's descendants rise to power, they will overthrow the dominance and control that Jacob's descendants held over them. It implies a future reversal of roles and a liberation from subjugation. Overall, this verse speaks to the relationship between Jacob and Esau, foretelling a future where Esau's descendants would have the opportunity to assert their independence and break free from the authority of Jacob's descendants. It foreshadows a cycle of power dynamics and highlights the consequences of Jacob's deception in obtaining the birthright and blessing that were rightfully Esau's. It's important to note that this verse should be understood within the context of the larger narrative of Genesis, and the ultimate fulfillment of these prophecies can be seen throughout the biblical account and the history of the Israelites and Edomites. Genesis chapter 27 verse 41. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. Context: Genesis chapter 27 narrates the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complicated relationship. In this particular verse, we see the aftermath of Jacob deceiving their father, Isaac, in order to receive the blessing intended for Esau. Deception and its consequences. Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, disguised himself as Esau and received the blessing of the firstborn from Isaac. When Esau discovered what had happened, he was filled with anger and hatred towards his brother Jacob. Esau's reaction reflects the serious consequences of deceit and the deep emotional wounds it can cause within families. The power of blessings. In the biblical narrative, blessings were highly regarded and carried significant weight. The blessing that Isaac bestowed upon Jacob was not just a simple wish, but a prophetic declaration of God's favor and future blessings. Esau's anger stemmed from the fact that his brother had received this important and irrevocable blessing, which could have brought him prosperity and authority. Unresolved conflict. Esau's response reveals the intensity of his emotions. He contemplated killing Jacob after their father's death, suggesting a deep-seated desire for revenge. This indicates that the tension between the two brothers had been building for some time, and the deception surrounding the blessing exacerbated their strained relationship. The importance of reconciliation. The story of Jacob and Esau serves as a reminder of the destructive power of bitterness, hatred, and unresolved conflict within families. The narrative also emphasizes the need for reconciliation and forgiveness. Eventually, in Genesis chapter 33, Jacob and Esau reconcile and embrace each other after many years of separation. This serves as a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness and the possibility of restoring broken relationships. Lessons for us today. As we reflect on this verse, we can learn several lessons. First, the consequences of deceit can be severe and long-lasting. It is essential to cultivate honesty and integrity in our interactions with others. Second, holding on to anger and nursing grudges only leads to further strife and brokenness. Instead, we should seek reconciliation and forgiveness, following the example set by Jacob and Esau's eventual reconciliation. Finally, we should recognize the significance of our words and actions, as they have the power to impact our relationships and the lives of others. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 41 teaches us about the consequences of deceit, the power of blessings, and the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness within families. It serves as a reminder for us to cultivate honesty, seek reconciliation, and choose forgiveness in our own lives. Genesis chapter 27 verse 42. And these words of Esau her elder son were told to Rebekah, and she sent and called Jacob her younger son, and said unto him, Behold, thy brother Esau, as touching thee, doth comfort himself, purposing to kill thee. This verse is situated in the narrative of the book of Genesis, which recounts the early history of God's chosen people, the Israelites, and the origins of various nations. Genesis chapter 27 tells the story of Jacob and Esau, twin brothers who had a complex relationship marked by deceit and rivalry. In the preceding verses, we learn that Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, tricked his aging and blind father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing that was intended for Esau, the elder son. Esau, upon discovering the deception, was filled with anger and planned to take revenge by killing Jacob. When Rebekah hears of Esau's intentions, she quickly sends for Jacob to inform him of the danger he is in. This verse reveals several significant aspects. Sibling rivalry. The relationship between Jacob and Esau had long been strained due to their differing personalities and their parents' favoritism. Jacob was known for his cunning and intelligence, while Esau was more rugged and favored by his father for his hunting abilities. The deception regarding the blessing exacerbates their conflict, leading Esau to contemplate murder. Deception's consequences. The events surrounding the stolen blessing illustrate the consequences of Jacob and Rebekah's deceitful actions. Their scheming not only strains family relationships but also jeopardizes Jacob's safety. It is a reminder that deception and manipulation can have far-reaching and unintended consequences. God's providence. Despite the deception and family turmoil, it is worth noting that God's ultimate purposes are at work throughout this narrative. In later chapters of Genesis, it becomes evident that God's plan was for Jacob to inherit the Abrahamic covenant and become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. While the deceitful actions of Jacob and Rebekah are not condoned, God's sovereignty is still evident in the unfolding of his divine plan. This verse serves as a pivotal moment in the story of Jacob and Esau, showcasing the consequences of deceit and the deep-rooted rivalry between brothers. It also reminds us of God's overarching plan, even in the midst of human failures and struggles. It is important to read the Bible in its entirety and consider the context and broader themes within each narrative, as well as seek guidance from spiritual leaders and biblical scholars, to gain a comprehensive understanding of the text. Genesis chapter 27 verse 43. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, and arise, flee thou to Laban my brother to Haran. Context: Genesis chapter 27 recounts the story of Jacob deceiving his father, Isaac, to receive his brother Esau's blessing. Isaac, who was old and blind, intended to bless Esau but was deceived by Jacob and inadvertently blessed him instead. When Esau discovered this, he was filled with anger and planned to kill Jacob. It is in this context that Genesis chapter 27 verse 43 takes place. Deception and its consequences. Genesis chapter 27 verse 43 reflects the consequences of deception and the breakdown of trust within a family. Jacob's deceit caused strife and division, leading to the necessity for him to flee from his brother's wrath. This verse serves as a reminder of the importance of honesty and the potential consequences of deceit. Obedience. Isaac instructs Jacob to obey his voice and flee to Laban, his uncle, in Haran. Despite the deceptive means by which Jacob received the blessing, Isaac acknowledges the reality of the situation and provides guidance for Jacob's safety. In this verse, obedience to parental authority is highlighted, even in difficult circumstances. God's providential plan. While Jacob's deception caused discord within the family, it is worth noting that God's providential plan was at work. God had already chosen Jacob to inherit the blessing that rightfully belonged to him, and this event became a part of God's unfolding plan for Jacob's life. Although Jacob's actions were deceitful, God ultimately used them to accomplish his purposes. God's protection. Isaac's instruction for Jacob to flee to Laban in Haran also reveals God's protection and guidance. Laban, though not without his own flaws, would play a significant role in Jacob's life, and through his time in Haran, Jacob would experience personal growth, develop a family of his own, and ultimately return to the land of Canaan as a transformed man. Lessons for today. Genesis chapter 27 verse 43 teaches us several valuable lessons. Firstly, it emphasizes the importance of honesty and the detrimental consequences of deceit and manipulation within relationships. Secondly, it underscores the significance of obedience to parental authority, even when the circumstances are challenging. Additionally, it reminds us that God can work through human failings and use them to accomplish his purposes, ultimately leading to personal growth and transformation. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 43 presents a pivotal moment in the narrative of Jacob's life, highlighting the consequences of deception, the importance of obedience, and God's providential plan for his chosen people. Genesis chapter 27 verse 44. And tarry with him a few days, until thy brother's fury turn away. This verse is a part of the narrative of Jacob and Esau, two twin brothers who had a complicated relationship. In this particular passage, Jacob's mother, Rebekah, suggests to Jacob that he should flee to her brother Laban's house until his brother Esau's anger subsides. To understand the context of this verse, let's briefly recap the preceding events. Isaac, the father of Jacob and Esau, was old and blind. He intended to bless his eldest son, Esau, with the birthright and the blessing that typically went to the firstborn. However, Rebekah favored Jacob and desired that he receive the blessing instead. She devised a plan to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing for Jacob. In Genesis chapter 27 verses 1 through 40, Rebekah assists Jacob in disguising himself as Esau by putting goatskins on his arms and neck, as Esau was a hairy man. Jacob, pretending to be Esau, approaches Isaac and receives the blessing meant for his brother. When Esau returns from hunting and realizes what has happened, he is furious and vows to kill Jacob. Rebekah hears of Esau's intentions and urges Jacob to flee to her brother Laban's house until Esau's anger subsides. Genesis chapter 27 verse 44 is part of Rebekah's advice to Jacob. This verse reflects the tension and potential danger that Jacob faced in the aftermath of receiving the blessing. It demonstrates the concern of Rebekah, who is aware of the consequences of Jacob's actions and seeks to protect him from Esau's wrath. From a spiritual perspective, This passage reveals the consequences of deceit and the importance of trust within families. The actions of Rebekah and Jacob demonstrate a lack of trust in God's promise to bless Jacob and a reliance on their own schemes. Rather than waiting for God's timing and trusting in His faithfulness, they took matters into their own hands, causing division and conflict within their family. This verse also highlights the theme of God's providence. Despite the deception and its consequences, God ultimately uses these events to fulfill His purposes. Jacob's journey to Laban's house becomes a significant turning point in his life, where he encounters God and undergoes personal growth and transformation. In summary, Genesis chapter 27 verse 44 captures a moment of concern and fear as Rebekah advises Jacob to flee to Laban's house until Esau's anger subsides. This verse reminds us of the consequences of deceit and the importance of trust in God's providence. It also sets the stage for Jacob's journey and the subsequent chapters of his life. Genesis chapter 27 verse 45. Until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send, and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day? This verse is part of the story of Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. The context of this verse is important to understand its meaning fully. In Genesis chapter 27, we find the account of Jacob deceiving his father Isaac in order to receive the blessing intended for his older brother Esau. Isaac, who was old and blind, wanted to bless Esau before he died. However, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, devised a plan to deceive Isaac and have Jacob receive the blessing instead. Upon discovering the deception, Esau was furious and planned to kill Jacob once their father died. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 45, Rebekah speaks to Jacob and informs him that he must flee to her brother Laban's house until Esau's anger subsides. She says, "Until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send, and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day?" Let's analyze this verse and its implications. Consequences of deception. Jacob's deceitful actions had severe consequences. Not only did he deceive his father, but he also strained his relationship with his brother Esau. Deception often leads to broken trust and damaged relationships. The need for reconciliation. Rebekah advises Jacob to wait until Esau's anger subsides and he forgets about the deception. This implies the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness in strained relationships. Time can help heal wounds and bring about reconciliation. Protection and divine intervention. Rebekah promises Jacob that she will send for him when it is safe to return. This shows that God's providence and protection are at work. Even in the midst of the consequences of Jacob's actions, God's plan and care are evident. Lessons on patience and timing. Rebekah's words indicate the need for patience and waiting for the right time. Sometimes, it is necessary to give time for healing and restoration to take place before attempting reconciliation. This verse reminds us of the consequences of deceit, the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness, and the need for patience and divine intervention in difficult situations. It also highlights God's providential care, even in times of strife and consequences resulting from our actions. Genesis chapter 27 verse 46. And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these which are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me? This verse occurs in the narrative of Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. The events leading up to this verse involve Jacob disguising himself as Esau to receive the blessing from his blind father Isaac. As a result, Jacob receives the blessing that was intended for Esau, causing Esau great distress. In this particular verse, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, expresses her concern about the daughters of Heth, who were the Canaanite women among whom Esau had taken wives. Rebekah, being from a different lineage and having been chosen by God to be Isaac's wife, was likely aware of the importance of maintaining the lineage through which the covenant promises of God would be fulfilled. She feared that if Jacob were to marry one of the Canaanite women, it would compromise their family's commitment to God's plan. Rebekah's statement, "I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth," reveals her deep concern and distress over the potential consequences of intermarriage between Jacob and the Canaanite women. She questions the purpose and value of her life if Jacob were to take a wife from the daughters of the land. This verse highlights an important theme in the Old Testament regarding the preservation of the Abrahamic lineage. God had made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bless his descendants and make them a great nation. Throughout the Bible, we see the importance placed on preserving the purity of the chosen lineage and avoiding intermarriage with pagan nations. This concern arises because intermarriage often led to the adoption of foreign gods and practices, which would undermine the exclusive worship of the one true God. Rebekah's words can also be seen as a reflection of her faith in God's plan. She recognized the significance of maintaining the family's commitment to God's promises and desired to protect that purpose. Rebekah's concern for the spiritual well-being of her family, as well as her understanding of God's covenant, led her to express her distress and seek a solution. This verse serves as a reminder to believers of the importance of being vigilant in upholding God's standards and remaining faithful to His plan. It emphasizes the significance of making choices that align with God's will, even in the face of potential challenges and temptations. Rebekah's concern can be seen as a reflection of the broader biblical theme of remaining set apart for God's purposes and avoiding compromises that may lead us astray. Overall, Genesis chapter 27 verse 46 provides insight into Rebekah's concern about Jacob's potential marriage to a Canaanite woman, highlighting the importance of preserving the chosen lineage and remaining faithful to God's covenant promises.